Welcome to EarthUp's Wildfire Preparedness from Fire to Smoke. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephen Bay. I'm the CEO and co-founder of EarthUP. I grew up in the Seattle area and never had to worry about smoke. I was able to go outside and play in the summer times and just not think about it. Now I have to put a mask on my daughter at certain times when it's smoky outside. And if you live on the West Coast, now you have to prepare for wildfire as well. We have customers that have asked for us to host a wildfire webinar to talk about the effects of wildfire, where it's going, and what to do when it's smoky outside. Our customers in Philadelphia and Boston experienced wildfire smoke for the first time, and they're asking for help. So we created this webinar. Something that's going on right now is that there's 79 active fires burning. Over 5 million acres have burned in 2021 alone, and this was never an issue in the past. So today we're going to be learning what's in store for us in the future. Why are the fires burning so much right now? And what can you do as an individual to protect yourself and protect your family? Our first guest is Professor Maureen Kennedy from the University of Washington, Tacoma. Maureen, can you jump in and say hi and tell us where you're calling from?
Hi, everybody. I work in the Tacoma campus, but I'm calling from Seattle, Washington.
Next up is Timothy. Timothy, can you give us a quick intro and tell us where you're calling in from?
Hello, I'm Timothy Inglesby. I'm Executive Director of Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology, and we're based in Eugene, Oregon.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. And our third guest is Dean Young, who some of the EarthUp listeners may know. We've had Dean on a podcast in the past. Dean, same question to you. A quick little intro and where you're calling in from.
Hi, I'm Dean, head of product at Aware. We do indoor air quality monitors, and calling in from, now sunny San Francisco. Was foggy earlier.
And finally, our co-host for today, EarthUp's content lead, Hunter Motz. Hunter, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name's Hunter. I spent my career at the intersection of science and storytelling, and I now head up content for EarthUp, and I'm calling from Marina del Rey, California. And I'm very excited to learn, like Stephen, why wildfires have gotten so bad.
Thank you, Hunter. So just so everybody knows what to expect from today's events, I will be co-hosting with Hunter. We're going to give each of the guests 10 minutes to run through some of the slides and talk about different aspects of fire season and smoke season. And then we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to drop them in the chat bar. And we will answer those questions while the webinar is going on, along with at the very end of it. Hunter, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Just in terms of, I just want to start by saying thank you to the guests for coming on. We're really, really lucky to have such incredible guests to tell us all about these issues, right? And to cover really the full scope of the problem from fire to smoke. Like Stephen, I have seen climate change happen before my very eyes on the Pacific Coast in terms of wildfires. 20 years ago when I moved to LA, there really was no wildfire smoke problem. We didn't really see it. And then, last summer, the sky was black and post-apocalyptic. And so, it can be a little confusing and upsetting to see that and not really understand why. But that's why we have scientists and experts. And our first expert is Dr. Maureen Kennedy, who has spent her life applying quantitative models and technology to understanding ecology and specifically wildfires. So Maureen, we're really excited to learn how have things been changing, why have they been changing, and what can we expect?
All right, I guess that's my turn then. Thanks. All right, thanks everybody. It's great to be here and it's great to be talking to you. I'm actually going to start a little off script and push back a little bit about the idea that the wildfires are something new to the area. They're new in our lifetime and even new in the last century, but actually wildfires have been around have been a major part of the Western United States for millennia. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. So if we can go to the first slide and we can just dig right into it. And so the next slide. Yeah, so again, talking about things that we didn't see growing up. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, never had a smoke day. Seattle, my first 10 years here, never had a smoke day, but this is becoming more and more common where we are all having to contend with the smoke. So let's talk about a little bit about how we got there. Next slide. And so we do know that in at least our sort of instrumental record here from the 1980s to today, that wildfire area burned is increasing, and it's costing more and more money for us to actually fight these wildfires. And so one of the questions that we often get asked and that we talk about, there seems to be some kind of debate between, is it climate change or is it forest management? And which is it? And how do we solve it? And so I'm going to sort of talk you through why actually it's not either or. It's sometimes both, it's sometimes one more than the other, and it really depends on where you are. So we can go to the next slide. And so to really talk through why that's true, we have to think about the fundamentals of fire behavior. And you're going to see, and I sort of took a preview of Tim's presentation too, that fire people love their triangles. There's triangles at all sorts of levels of wildfire. We call this the fire behavior triangle. So fire behavior is how hot a fire is burning, how fast, how rapidly it's spreading through the landscape, how severe are its effects, its intensity, its heat that it's generating, the difference between whether it's just going to sort of go through and just burn out the small fuels on the ground, or if it's actually going to kill entire trees and move into, say, homes. That's all determined by the fire behavior. And so on one edge of the triangle is the topography. Now, there's not much we can do about topography as human beings. That's kind of an act of God kind of thing, right? So it's whether the hill slope is flat or if it's steep, whether you're going uphill or downhill, whether it's on a ridge or a valley, which way, whether the hill is facing north or south. All of those things can affect the fire behavior, but we're going to put that to the side. There's not much humans can do at that scale to affect topography. The other side of the fire behavior triangle is the weather. And I know Tim's going to talk about that a little bit more as well. For example, wind. Wind is a strong driver of how a fire behaves. You hear about those red flag warnings. Those are really, really high winds. That makes wildfires really difficult to control. Temperature, of course, relative humidity, precipitation, hotter and drier, generally speaking, makes wildfires more dangerous. It makes them burn more intensely. And so weather really relates to the fuel moisture. How dry are those things that we have that are going to be burning up during the wildfire? Sorry. And so weather, sorry, we're still there. Sorry. And so the last side of the triangle are the fuels themselves. So if you think about how you build up a campfire, for example, are your fuels fine? Those would be the kindling that are really easy to burn, but they burn really fast and go away. Are they heavy? That's sort of the next layer of fuels, right? You have your kindlings, you put on that the bigger logs. If the kindling burns hot enough, then the bigger stuff can burn for longer and hotter. Arrangement and continuity, right? Again, if you're building your campfire, if you really pack the kindling in there really tight so air can't flow through it, that's hard to light on fire. If they're a little bit looser, where you can get some oxygen moving through, then that's easier to burn. And so if we think about the two sides of the triangle, the weather and the fuels, we are in a sense talking about climate and forest management, because our actions for forest management can impact all of these dimensions of the fuels. Climate change, for example, can increase temperature. It can increase the duration and severity of drought. It can lengthen the fire season. So that really affects the fire weather that might be occurring as a fire burns. And so the fire behavior triangle, those two sides really sort of correspond to the climate and forest management. So start with the fuels. Next slide. And so fuels can drive and underlie potential fire behavior. And when I started, I mentioned that fires aren't new. It's just that the United States, in the Western United, well, the United States in general, has had what seemed to be, at least in the 20th century, a very successful policy of fire suppression. We were able to stop pretty much all fires from occurring throughout the Western US. The problem was, we see here on the left-hand side of the slide, the kinds of forest structures, particularly in the dry forests in the Western United States. Think of the east of the Cascade Mountains in Washington State, the Sierra Nevada in California. We had these really wide open forests where the trees are very far apart, where frequent fire historically that either set by lightning or actually indigenous peoples set controlled burns on purpose to this effect to manage the fuels, creating these wide open, beautiful forests with large, spaced out, fire resistant trees. And so if a fire were to burn through the left-hand landscape, even if it's in extreme weather, it would mostly be a moderate to high intensity surface fire because there's no continuity in the fuels. And those fires, and Tim will help me out here, are relatively easy to suppress. So we had forest structures where the fires themselves, even if it was hot and dry, were relatively easy to suppress because the fire behavior was low. So we stopped all those fires. We stopped them, which meant there was no mechanism to clear out the fuels and maintain that structure. So we fast forward a century to the right-hand side of the slide, where these forests then have a lot of ingrowth. They have a lot of fuels that have built up, creating continuity between the surface and the canopy. And that middle figure there shows you the kinds of fire behavior that can result from that arrangement of fuels. And so we've created, by suppressing the fires, we've created an extreme fuel hazard situation where even under moderate conditions, these fires can exhibit really extreme and unsafe behavior. Under really extreme weather conditions, then we have the kinds of fires that we're seeing right now, like, for example, the Dixie Fire in California. And so that's a question of, that is one of the aspects of forest management that has actually led us to where we are today. If we go to the next slide. And what we really understand is that wildfires can be self-limiting. And so this is a little GIF of fires in the Sierra Nevada, California, near Yosemite. The big one in the middle there, if you might have heard of it, was a rim fire from several years ago. And you can see as the fires fill in the landscape, they tend to stop at areas that have previously been burned. We call that self-limiting. So a wildfire, a fire itself, can remove fuels and act as a brake for a subsequent fire. But something else you might notice is that at first, in the early 2000s, the fires were all kind of small. Those are the fires that we were able to suppress. And so if a fire is burning under moderate or mild conditions, we can suppress it successfully, which means it's not really big enough to help limit the spread of the next fire that might happen under more extreme conditions. And so our action of suppression actually loses this ecosystem service that wildfire can actually provide. And of course, the effectiveness of that limitation runs out after approximately 10 years. You can see eventually we start burning over the same areas again. And the big fires are occurring in areas that hadn't been allowed to burn previously. Go to the next slide. So that's the fuels side of the triangle, and that really is a matter of forest management. Climate change side, the weather side of the triangle, is we know that given this hazardous fuel situation that we've created, climate change is undoubtedly making things worse, making it even harder to suppress the wildfires. And so these are projections of temperature in Washington state from a kind of recent, I probably need to update the graph, but the picture is going to be the same. Hotter, drier, right? That's what climate change is going to do. And so these warmer and drier conditions, given these overstocked forests, are what make wildfires even more dangerous. Is it management? Is it climate change? Put those things together and you've created this perfect storm of extreme fire behavior. Go next slide. And so climate change obviously is a big issue that we need to work on and that we need to solve. But there's also more local things that, say, a forest manager can do to help at least reduce in some areas this extreme fire behavior, and that's managing the fuels. That's something we have some control over in the near term locally. And so we think about bad fires, which we're getting right now, versus good fires that happened historically before the Europeans came and settled here and screwed everything up, is basically what happened. And so we can use these fuels reduction treatments by essentially burning our way out of the problem. And hopefully, if we can do this on a large enough scale, return to a state where wildfire takes care of itself. So we see on the top here a little schematic from actual data of an untreated forest. Below that, where we do mechanical thin, so you take out the smallest trees, leave the largest fire-resistant trees, followed by a prescribed fire that clears out the surface fuels. And hopefully you can see on the right-hand side there a landscape from a fire in Arizona where it goes from black to brown to green. The black is the untreated forest, extreme fire behavior. That transition from black to brown is the edge of the fuels treatment where the fire behavior actually was reduced to eventually burn as a low intensity or moderate intensity surface fire through homes. You can see the roads and everything. This was a town in Arizona where none of the homes were lost, even though this extreme wildfire was sort of barreling down on the homes. So next slide. Hopefully I'm almost out of time, but last slide. And so the fuels management doesn't have to be something that government agencies take care of in the wildland. It's also something that can be done closer to home. And this was true in that town in Arizona. People followed what we call fire-wise or fire-safe practices, where you sort of have ever increasing zones where you remove fuels away from the proximity to your home if the fuels treatment and other actions outside of the community are doing their job, and you do these things around your home, then it increases the chances that your home actually survives a wildfire. I think last slide, I think. And so I'm a college professor. Sorry, I gave you reading, I gave you homework, just a few extra things to have a look at if you're interested in learning more about some of these topics. Thanks.
Well, Maureen, thank you so much for giving us our homework, and thank you so much also for pushing back on the idea that this is an entirely new problem. A couple of quick questions. One, I think, certainly for me, I would naively assume the more greenery, the healthier the forest, right? I think a lot of us assume that and tend to assume that chopping down any trees is like a step back for the environment, right? But you're really drawing this distinction between that a healthy forest may be a well-spaced forest rather than an overgrown forest.
Yeah, it's really a matter of place and the sorts of forest structures that a climate really can actually support. So on the west side of the Cascades, yes, green, lush, lots of water, they do really well. On the east side of the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada, for example, these actual overstocked forests actually, for example, make the forest more susceptible to drought because all of those trees are sucking and competing for the water in the soil. They make them more susceptible to insect infestations because it's of such high density. It's easier for the bugs to move around in the forest. And so what looks like a healthy forest is really going to depend on sort of the ecological region that the forest actually exists in.
But so you're advocating for exactly the kind of nuance that our current political climate hates.
Yeah. Yes. So there has to be some room, and particularly, so prescribed fire, for example, a controlled wildfire is really an excellent way to reduce fuels. But climate change is actually making it harder to do that safely because the window of opportunity for the kinds of moderate conditions is becoming more and more rare, for example. And if you don't do the kind of mechanical treatment of the smaller fuels before the controlled fire, very often you can't get that controlled fire to burn hot enough to clear out what we call those ladder fuels, like the small trees. And so it's not quite as effective. The other side of the coin, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when you say that window of opportunity, right, there used to be a fire season, and then there was sort of the part of the year where there wasn't a real risk of fire, and that part of the year where there wasn't a real risk is smaller and smaller. So essentially the winter is not as reliable for doing those controlled burns.
Exactly. And that window of opportunity, because let's say in the mountains, it's actually too cold and wet to actually get a decent fire. So there's that sweet spot between the active fire season and the dead of winter, a very narrow opportunity to safely implement something like a prescribed fire. And I think Tim can speak to that a little bit more, what that looks like. But yeah. But just one last thing about the fuels treatment sort of environmentally, and definitely sort of there's this instinct of, no, we can't go in there with machines and take out the trees. But at the end of the day, if you keep those small trees in, very often those are just going to burn up and kill the big trees that we really value.
Right.
At the same time. The hard part is this is actually not the fuels reductions treatment that work best are not friendly to the timber industry because those small trees aren't very valuable. And so that's actually economically, it's a difficult, it's expensive to do.
Yeah. And I mean, I've seen some attempts to do that with sort of trying to monetize biochar around. So there are some attempts. And then one last thing is, I think a really, really important takeaway from your talk, right, is that we have to resist the sort of the politicization of forest management versus climate change, because a robust strategy, we have to do whatever we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I really recommend one of those readings was a Seattle Times editorial by a colleague of mine, Crystal Raymond, that makes that exact argument. It's not either or. And we need to, as you said earlier, sort of consider the nuance of what makes sense for where and when.
Well, in terms of getting onto those front lines, Maureen, thank you so much for giving us the big picture view of what's going on. And we're really lucky now to be able to talk to Timothy Inglesby, who will take us onto the front lines. Tim has fought wildfires all across the United States. And he's going to tell us what it's like to actually get out there and what we can do as homeowners. Spoiler alert, you should not turn on your sprinklers if there's a wildfire coming towards you. So Tim, we're really excited to learn that frontline perspective.
Well, thank you so much. I am a certified red-carded wildland firefighter, but I choose to stay on the back lines so I can do things like this for all my comrades out there on the front lines right now. So just start with the first slide, because well, the one before, I guess I thought I had a title slide, but okay. In the bottom, you see our little logo, and Maureen is absolutely correct. We love triangles in the fire community, and my organization, promotes safe, ethical, ecological fire management. And it's a triangle to us in that everything is interdependent in the other. So firefighter and public safety is number one, but it's related to professional environmental ethics, ethical public service, whatever. That's the kind of heart of our mission, but ecology is the bottom line. And that's how we kind of see it as a holistic system. They all have to be integrated. You can't sacrifice one for the others or the system collapses. I do want to credit EarthUP for a real progressive advance in conceptualizing the issue, because we're still locked in this paradigm, and here's Smokey over my shoulder, whatever. Only you can prevent wildfires, and that's just not true. Wildfires have been part of the Earth's ecology for 420 million years. So we can't, one of the take-home messages is we can't prevent all wildfires, nor can firefighters stop all wildfires. So everyone must be prepared for wildfires. So I really credit EarthUP for that conceptualization. Okay, next slide, please. This is ironic, but we're coming up on the first anniversary of the what we call the West Side East Wind Firestorm here in Oregon. It was a climate-driven wildfire event. This east wind blew from British Columbia to Baja, Mexico, and it was just like a bulldozer just pummeling the west slope of the Cascades, particularly here in Oregon, but all the way through California. Any existing wildfire blew up and rapidly expanded. And here in Oregon, we had some brand new fires started in the worst places, the valley bottoms from down power lines. And with that east wind, it was like hurricane force winds, hot, dry, steady. It was these ignitions were like a blowtorch in a wind tunnel, and extreme rapid rates of spread. Most of our crews are already in California at the suppression sieges there. So the first crews that arrived at some of these fires, they were overwhelmed from the moment they arrived, and they couldn't even engage the fire. They were just helping evacuate people out of there. And fortunately, there were people who lost their lives, thousands of homes destroyed. It's still a year later, and many of those people who lost everything, their lives have been forever altered and uprooted, and so our hearts go out to them. But beyond those within the reach of flames, the smoke inundated the entire West Coast. There was no escape, clear out to the ocean. And then it blew back across the country and beyond. So really, we're all living in the fire zone, either with flames or smoke. It's all our issues. It's just not just a West Coast issue. The whole country is it's a five-alarm fire here. Okay, next slide, please. So, love these triangles. And the three major drivers of the wildfire crisis: climate change, past, present, and perhaps future land management, and then the wildland-urban interface. You might call it rural, ex-urban sprawl, or whatever, the housing patterns and settlement and designs of homes. These three, too, are all integrated in this issue. And so I'm going to kind of emphasize climate change and land management briefly. So next slide, please. So, you know, of all the markers of climate change, melting polar ice caps, ferocious hurricanes, and tsunami, rising sea levels, mass floods, here in the West, it's wildfire. That's the dominant specter of climate change here. And the dominant image of wildfire is a burning home. I just want to pause and question it. Is that really a wildfire, a burning home? In our view, wildfires are in wild lands. So that's something to think about. But you know, in terms of wildfire, climate change is now in everyone's backyard, front yard, and we're all, you know, kind of involved in the results of the problem and perhaps the solution as well. Next slide, please. And as Maureen was noting, you know, these large wildfires driven by hot, dry, windy conditions. In the fire community, we call this a red flag warning. It means firefighters, be on the alert. Things could get dicey. And I think from the future now, you know, red flag warnings will not just be issued amongst fire crews. They should be publicly broadcast, like tornado watches, tornado warnings. Get ready. Conditions could be dicey. And by all these metrics, you know, wildfires are getting more active in this era of climate change. And I want to especially stress these faster rates of spread. That's really the issue. That's what's overwhelming fire crews. That's what's leading to, you know, last minute rush evacuations, people, extremely rapid rates of spread. But, you know, wildfire, again, has been part of the Earth's ecology for millions of years. Scientists call wildland fire a natural disturbance. I prefer to call it ecological stimulus, but what's making a natural disturbance become unnatural disasters are these social metrics, these human causes or consequences. And I think particularly for the EarthUP community, mass evacuations, these immense disruptions of social life are just as impactful, perhaps, as those who may lose their homes or others. I mean, it's really an issue, and again, we're all involved here. So, bottom line is climate change is increasing the frequency and duration of these red flag warning conditions, of which fire crews are not able to stop fire spread during those conditions. Next slide, please. And you know, I know that most of the news media loves these images of raging crown fires, 200-foot flame lengths on the treetop levels. That's not really what's driving these large wildfires. They're not these giant tsunamis of flames rolling across the landscape. They're these ember washes. Things are so dry and the air temperature is so hot and the wind's so strong. It just takes a spark, a single tiny ember landing on these dry fuels to start a new fire. So that's how fires are spreading. They're kind of hopscotching across the landscape, sometimes going ridge to ridge, leapfrogging across fire lines. And you see here, these firefighters, they're trying to attack these embers with a fire hose on full, and it's just not capable of stopping fire spread in this kind of rapid rate of spread from embers. Next slide. And we had a famous example in 2017 at the Eagle Creek fire, which traumatized the community around Portland. These folks here marveling, they're in Washington State, marveling at the spectacle of that fire. Little did they know that one ember had sailed across the Columbia, about a mile wide at that point, and started a spot fire behind them. You know, there's no fire crew that could improve on the Columbia River as a fire line to contain fire spread. Next slide, please. So this is every rural homeowner's fantasy. In case of fire, you're going to have a Type 1 engine there with a crew ready, retardant air tanker dropping in your backyard, and you'll be all safe. Yet just looking at this photo, there's things that put this homeowner at risk. That power line in their backyard. We know they're very vulnerable to these high wind events. This house is perched at a steep slope with brush right there at the edge of their pavement. This is everyone's fantasy who lives in rural America. Next slide, please. But the reality is that a single wildfire can threaten hundreds of homes simultaneously, overwhelming our capacity. And even if we had, more engines and more air tankers and more hand crews, the conditions of these particular red flag warnings, fire crews cannot stop fires. So that's the issue. They're just, when wildfires enter into urban, suburban areas, they transition into WUI fires, wildland urban interface fires, in which case wildland firefighters really have no role. There's nothing I can do with my Pulaski to put out your house on fire. So that's another issue. Next slide, please. And when wildfires transition into WUI fires, what often happens is like a domino effect. It triggers house-to-house ignitions, because a home could burn for hours, and that heat just ignites the next house. And note that where you see the ash mounds of incinerated homes standing above and around them are green, maybe scorched canopies of big old trees. That's an important thing to note. Next slide, please. Because what we're discovering with our science is that houses can be more flammable than forests. And I took this picture. I'm standing in the paved highway looking at the ruins of a home, and there's the Mackenzie River, and there's not 50 feet between the river and the road. And again, no fire crew can improve on a paved highway or a rolling river as a fire line to protect, to stop fire spread. This home burned down, didn't burn up, it burned down from an ember, landing on its roof and just kind of worked its way down. So houses, how we've built them, designed them, located them, we didn't build them for living in a fire-prone environment. Next slide, please. And that's why we must be prepared for those fires that we can't stop and or prevent. So the war metaphor, it empowers a fire community, the concept of firefighting. And there's this notion, most of our political leaders, we could just, if we just hit them hard and put them out when they're small and quick, we'll be safe. With just enough crews and resources and especially money, we can win the war on wildfire. Next slide, please. Well, that's their fantasy, but this is the reality, is that our 20th century firefighting strategies and tactics are losing out to our 21st century climate. And this is more the scene. Fire crews forced to run away from flames, just overwhelming them. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, this has become the paradox, as Maureen pointed out, that all of our past successful suppression is part of the story of our current failures to prevent or stop all wildfires. And aggressive firefighting becoming more risky for firefighters, more expensive for taxpayers, and much more damaging to ecosystems, but less effective. So what crews are forced to do, not lean on the shovels, to have their hands on your hips, standing miles away, backing off, burning out, hoping for the best. Next slide, please. So what my organization promotes is ecological fire management that works with nature and natural processes, particularly wildland fire. Fire is nature's recycler of all that dead down material, turns it from wooden sticks to soil nutrients, and creates all this kind of wonderful wildlife habitat. And I could go on and on about that, but maximize the benefits of burning, one of which is protecting communities. And this is what we discovered. It's kind of anecdotally, but last year during the fire siege in California, we threw everything at those fires. The August complex, the nation's gigafire, we put all that big iron in the sky, all that heavy metal on the ground, thousands of crews, nothing affected that fire spread except recent wildfire areas. That's where it influenced the spread, the behavior. And so working with wildfire instead of fighting against all wildfires, that is great for community protection, because fire influences fire like nothing else. And it also is part of the ecosystem, and it's great for ecological restoration. And doing this in ways that will mitigate the risk to firefighters, the public, and property, minimize the taxpayer costs. We're shelling out billions, much of it, I have to say, in futility, trying to fight against nature. And it's going to involve Smokey taking a drip torch instead of a shovel and lighting more fires. And that's what we're doing right now. Crews are lighting up immense amount of acreage under the worst weather and fuel conditions. We need to flip the switch and let them do that under the best weather and fuel conditions for managing fire behavior and achieving desired fire effects. But the first step is homeowner community fire preparation. And I want to emphasize, it takes all of us. It takes a whole village. It takes a whole community. Because if you do your part for your own home or business and your neighbor doesn't, they're the ones that put you at risk if their home ignites from a tiny ember landing on the roof or a small little flame marching up to their door. So it's going to take all of us working together. And particularly homeowners and firefighters, we need a kind of a partnership there. Okay, next slide. I believe that's it. And thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Timothy. And, also thank you again for everything that you and the firefighting community do to keep us safe. I mean, you guys are literally risking your lives to save people's homes, and it's about as noble as it gets. I really want to talk about because there was that third part of the triangle that you were talking about, the people living in sort of wildland urban interfaces, right? And we see that in Southern California because essentially everything is so expensive that you start to find that the cheaper homes are a little bit further up the hill, a little bit more on the outskirts of the city. But there's a real price to living in those areas, right?
There is. And that is, that's what we're discovering. There's a lot of poor folks live in rural America, a lot of elderly folks, disabled folks, and they are, that's where like cheap land, cheap housing, and they are most at risk and most vulnerable. And so, we have sponsored a program. We got a law passed here in Oregon, putting young kids to work in these communities for these residents, sweeping the needles off their roof, pruning the shrubs under their eaves, helping them out be prepared for those fires, and particularly those who lack the physical or economic ability to do this kind of work for themselves. It's going to take all of us working together as a community.
Yeah, one of my best friends grew up in Paradise, California, and it was actually built as a retirement community. And so there were a lot of old folks that moved out there, and obviously they were, they lost the entire, that was, Paradise was really the first city that I think sort of we cottoned on to a whole town can be wiped out by fire. But so in terms of homeowner management, Stephen joked before we came on that we should all switch on our sprinklers because a lot of people in Tahoe have done that because they thought that would keep their homes safe. That was a terrible idea. Why was that a terrible idea? And then tell us about some of the good things we can do as homeowners to protect our homes and to reduce that risk, and some of the things we definitely should not do.
Well, yeah, turning on your sprinklers, running your hoses will lower the water pressure for the crews who need those hoses full on to stop a house ignition. The best thing a homeowner can do is long before that first whiff of smoke, get yourself a plan. Get yourself your go bag, get yourself. So especially when things are stressful and you're not going to be thinking straight, get your house scene together and then start working around some of your vegetation. We're going to have to change our aesthetic thing. Everyone loves their little dense green screen from their neighbors, makes them feel private. That puts you both at risk. you might have to open up our landscape and, kind of bond as a community for, mutual support and mutual preparation. I think we might explore too around the outer rings of communities, making more greenways, multi-use recreational park-like thing. That will give crews more maneuverability, more real defensible space to protect the whole community, because we just can't be hotspotting individual homes as they ignite on fire. It's kind of too late.
Right, and there's also a lot of resources at Firewise in terms of cleaning out your gutters. Even one of the things you alluded to, right? Very often these fires are starting on roofs and then spreading down. So making sure that, your chimney is not open to the outside, because embers can really easily get into the home that way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then the other question, I think that, as we transition into our final speaker, let's talk about smoke. Obviously, firefighters, are on the. Oh, that was a very appropriate cough. But you guys are really on the front lines. You're the canaries in the coal mine. You're exposed to much more of that smoke, and so you can tell us just how bad that smoke is, and what the rest of us can expect if we're going to be exposed every single year to more and more smoke. How bad is wildfire smoke for us?
I try to forget all the forest I inhaled in my youth, and I was on some of the smokiest fires, off the charts in terms of terrible air quality. And here's the problem. There are very few fire-free forests in North America, and there are no smoke-free fires. So you're going to get smoke with fire, one form or another. But trying to prevent all fires, and then when they come, they blow up and they burn for weeks on end, that's not working. It's really through managing fire that we can manage smoke at the same time. Working with, playing the wind, if you will. We're going to light this place on fire and get nice, low severity effects, save the big trees, and blow the smoke away from communities. That's how we manage for smoke. But it is inevitable. And so I think, future architecture is going to have air filtration for viruses or smoke or whatever in every building. And we have to care for those people who are smoke sensitive. You know who they are in your block and make sure they're cared for as a community. So, but there's no avoiding, there's no preventing smoke. And that's the greatest irony I can't stress. The adage, fighting fire with fire, well, when they try to put out wildfires to avoid smoke, mostly they're lighting up fires. They're fighting smoke with smoke. So we got to flip that switch and get our smoke and our fire during the right times and places and conditions where we can manage for both for public health and environmental health.
Well, and it's clear from both you and Maureen that the idea of more controlled burns, more prescribed burns, and really harnessing some of that indigenous wisdom, right? Because traditional peoples from Australia to the Pacific Northwest have all harnessed fire. And so maybe in terms of changing those metaphors, right, instead of talking about firefighters, we should talk about fire managers.
Exactly. Well put.
And now over to Stephen Bay, who now knows not to switch on his sprinklers if wildfire is threatening his home, who is going to introduce us to a longtime friend of EarthUP, Dean Young.
Thank you, Hunter, and thank you, Tim and Maureen. That was I learned a lot there, so thank you a lot for that. And I don't have sprinklers, so I don't have to worry about turning on sprinklers at my house. But to cap off the virtual chat, we have Dean Young. Dean is the head of product for Aware. Aware are our favorite air quality sensors. We tested a bunch of them, and basically they help you understand what's going on the indoor environment. And as smoke season hits, we've been able to see outdoor air quality versus indoor air quality. And we are lucky enough to have Dean here to tell us about things that we can do, how smoke can actually affect our bodies, why is it a negative thing for us to be breathing in smoke, and how can we really monitor and protect our houses, as we know that fire season will probably be inevitable for a while. So thank you, Dean.
Yeah, thank you, and really great talks from Maureen and Timothy. This is a pretty near and dear topic to me. I mean, I grew up part of the time in Montana, and I remember 2000 season, and probably literally 100 fires in a 100-mile radius in that area, and got evacuated a couple times. And we were bringing smoke nearly every day, ash falling from the sky. So that, and having studied kind of what's going on with our climate, and kind of applying those learnings and things to what I do now, and in indoor air quality monitoring, and ultimately empowering folks with the information to better manage their air, to protect themselves. As we've heard, it's becoming more and more our reality, and so having these mega fire events and extreme smoke days outside. Um, I didn't get the memo on the triangles, so you may see a lot more circles and rounded edges in my slides. So I'll be sure to catch that next time. So if you go to the first slide, just a little bit of background where we've worked with a ton of folks in commercial spaces. We have indoor air quality monitors also for residential, individuals, personal use, things like that. We're founded several years ago, and we've really kind of got this end-to-end solution. The on device display and everything, but sending data to the cloud, and aggregating it, like really getting our clients and customers access to data. Oftentimes on the commercial side, it's locked up in the BMS or these other places that kind of building management system that teams that need to react to fires or tell employees to stay home, or, oh, hey, by the way, it's safe here. They don't have access to that data. Or they might not be able to optimize certain systems within the building, or even at home. Like, we have some integrations with the major thermostats, and sometimes the best thing you can do is just run that HVAC fan to run the dirty air through the filter in your indoor system. So next slide. Yeah, so I spoke to a degree of those commercial sites, and everybody from tenants, clients, schools, employees, everybody's got invested interest in this good indoor air quality. And it's really like year round. It might be wildfires this season. I think you touched on, like, sometimes it's viruses in the air, whatever else. But and again, with wildfires, it very predictably comes back every year. Maybe is off by a couple of weeks, but we see usually every year kind of an influx of folks preparing for wildfire season in their offices and things. They had a particularly bad year last year. You can bet that they're going to come around and start preparing for the next year. Next slide. And so it is also relevant to folks at home. Nowadays, more than ever, we're spending 9% of our time indoors. I would probably say that's even higher than that at this point. I saw a survey once on LinkedIn. It was like, how many hours of the day do you spend outdoors? And I couldn't understand who was spending less than 20 hours indoors. You know, I can't think of a time, a usual day that I spend more than 4 hours outdoors, but those people must be pretty lucky. And we think of our home as kind of this safe haven. We've got our HVAC, we've got our air filters, we got all these things, to protect us in there. But the truth of the matter is, we don't all live in modern homes with very well sealed, windows and doors and vents and things like, or backdraft and all sorts of other things. So And even if you do, you still need to ventilate every once in a while, or else you'll just kind of choke on the carbon dioxide building up in your very tightly sealed home. So, as Timothy said, like, we're going to need to design our homes to not only keep the bad stuff out, but filter it, once it comes in, because inevitably it will. I mean, when it's 500 micrograms per meter cubed of PM 2.5, like, in the thick of a wildfire, things like that. I mean, which is an extreme amount of particulate matter. Um, that at some point, some or a lot of that is going to come in, and so with these elevated levels outdoors, it's just getting sucked into our home or leaking in. And there's much more beyond just PM 2.5, which we'll talk about in a second. There are total volatile organic compounds, so a mixture of these gases that usually have a carbon in them. So if you think about burning fuels and carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and other lengthy carbon chain chemicals, those are traveling hundreds, thousands of miles, and depending on the weather systems and stuff, they can get ultra concentrated in certain regions. So going to the next slide. Yeah, so just dive into these a little bit. The PM 2.5, as you can see in the graphic, like is really, really small, much smaller than human hair. I think it's something like 40 of them, you could fit on the width of a human hair. And why we focus on that one in particular, like PM10 also pretty bad, bigger, smaller, all of those, but PM 2.5, when you inhale it, it gets into your lungs. It can actually go through that sort of lung blood barrier and go mess things up in your brain, all sorts of stuff. So I don't want I want to spare you some of the details, but it can exacerbate a lot of conditions like asthma and COPD and heart disease. They're linking it to all sorts of like reproductive issues, developmental issues, et cetera. As we become more aware, study the effects of PM 2.5. I think that in like Southeast Asia there are a ton of studies because they have that. PM 2.5 doesn't predominantly come from wildfires there. Instead, it's maybe like factory smoke and coal emissions and things like that. But it's sort of the same stuff. It crosses that that barrier in your venous system. So TVOC, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are these chemicals that are being given off. Carbon monoxide, so it's one carbon, one oxygen. You probably know that trying to avoid building up those levels in your home, you might have a carbon monoxide detector. Fun fact, those detectors or alarms really are meant to trigger at like very elevated levels, but even at low levels, it can cause sort of like confusion and drowsiness and things like that. And so, even if you have low levels for a long time, you can be affected by that. Kind of another way to look at PM 2.5 too is like just your typical like pollution, or you'll often see it in smog. Soot, dust, or fine dust, as Aware likes to call it. Next slide. Yeah, so looking at a little case study, I pulled some of my own data from 2018 Camp Fire. So I'm here in San Francisco, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, whether it was last year, we had the crazy skies, like orange, and everybody was freaking out. I'm like, have you guys never seen like a wildfire sky before? But way back in 2018, when we had like the Paradise fires, and really kind of a unique climate conditions that brought heavy amounts, like even more than in 2020, PM 2.5, again, those TVOC, the carbon monoxide being one of them, down into the Bay Area, and it just hung out here, in extreme amounts for uh, several several days to a week. And so in this graphic on the right, you can see, again, I mentioned I have circles, but I have a circle around kind of, roughly the time when we had these very elevated outdoor carbon monoxide. And sure enough, on the left hand side there's the TVOCs, which CO is a member of that group. And you can see that even indoors, it was seeping in. It's much easier for a gas to seep in, but my TVOC levels were raised indoors, which was pretty alarming. I was thinking during the time, uh, I don't have any sources indoors, like what's going on. And I looked outside at outdoor data streams, and sure enough, that CO was very elevated that week. Next slide. And then additionally, looking at the particulate matter, again, that 2.5 microns and less, you can see that these are daily means on the right hand side, the average of the whole day. So there were actually periods where it was much higher than the roughly 100, 150 ish. And Yeah, so again, that was seeping in, even with, I had already prepared, and I had air filters running, standalone ones. I shut doors. I'll get into some other tactics to protect yourself. But even with that, the amount outside was just overpowering all these efforts that I was taking inside. So it really does take a much bigger effort, designing homes and home systems and office systems to bring these down much better. Next slide. Yeah, so we track these different measures, and really we're kind of in the business of balancing all of them, all the factors. If you over index for one, like getting PM 2.5 or TVOCs down, like are you in the summer elevating that indoor temperature because or are you having to bring in more fresh air some other way rather than having windows open? So it can be kind of difficult to manage, balance these different air factors, um, and without measuring them, it's hard to know if you're taking one uh, um, mitigation strategy and causing others. Next slide. Yeah, so as mentioned, I have some tips. One thing you can do to prepare before wildfire season, before it gets super smoky in your region, is to use CO2. And there are some great like calculations and tool spreadsheets that you can use. Um, Basically, what you want to do is fill up the space with CO2, either by shutting all the windows and everything, and just breathing a lot, or if you want to speed things up a little bit, you can bring in some dry ice and just like really fill up the space. And then once you get it to sort of like peak levels, you can just watch those levels go down, and that'll not like naturally dissipate. It's essentially leaking out. And so wherever that CO2 is leaking out and how quickly, you could think of the opposite of that as PM 2.5, and those TVOC like coming in. So that might be a way to patch up holes and come up with strategies to, depending on what types of leaks you have. definitely, get an air purifier. You might have a whole home HVAC system with a filter in it. Make sure that MERV rating is high. Another term to pay attention to is the CADR, so clean air delivery rate. If you don't have a high enough Cadr, CADR, then like me in 2018 where I was underpowered, I'm not going to be able to bring those PM 2.5 levels down low enough. I was having to wear a mask indoors, N95 mask. Just thought about sleeping with it too. Yeah, and if you find the PM 2.5, isn't you're not able to bring that down home wide or apartment wide, what have you, try to seal off a smaller room, and your air purifier might be a little more suited to a smaller space, but at least you've got a safe zone, a safe room where you can focus. Yep, again, N95s, make sure you got a box of those. I can't tell you how much I hear about people trying to buy them last minute and paying, through the nose because they didn't prepare ahead of time. If you can't find an air purifier, you can actually build your own. Some great either kits or instructions online. So even just a box fan with some off-the-shelf filters. Anything you can do, to be honest, is going to help. Even if it's not like 100%. And then keep an eye on those indoor levels and compare to outdoor. I'd say like one thing to pay attention to is like that number that's available everywhere is the AQI, or the air quality index. There is a little bit of a lag effect of when we would see here in the Bay Area, people are like, oh, it's coming up green, but I smell smoke. It's like, well, that can often be based on 8-hour averages, 12-hour averages, 24-hour averages. So it might be too little too late to, kind of go indoors. So try to look for, like PM 2.5 values outdoors, some sources of that. There are a ton online. Yeah, and next slide. Yeah, so happy to answer any questions, and it's been really fun.
Well, thank you for that, Dean. I know me personally, I have little kids and everything too, and so I try to prepare for the fire season, and we actually have a fire season checklist on EarthUP that people and employees can go look at to how to prepare. But as people are looking at actions that they can take, is you said weatherization. So is air sealing your home one of the main actions that you would say for anybody that has an older home? Is that kind of one of the main actions that they can take before fire season that will help kind of stop the infiltration of PM 2.5?
Yeah, I mean, you're never going to be able to get, completely sealed, and that might not even long term be super healthy either. There are a lot of movements like Passive House and various others that, trying to get ventilation because again, you don't want to choke on your own CO2. But definitely, trying to keep as much of it out while still allowing some breathing. And if you can't keep all of it out, then filtering it out in the indoors.
The good news about that for everybody listening is that by air sealing your house, you're actually improving the comfort, you're saving money on energy bills. So there's a bunch of other reasons to kind of go and air seal your house. You do want to be careful, like you were saying, Dean, if you air seal your house too tight, right, you're trapping a lot of contaminants in. So when you have a new couch or anything like that, you're trapping that in there. The other thing that you mentioned was a MERV 13 filters if you have a ventilation system. That really just kind of cleans the air inside your house most of the time, right? So how, if you've been in the house, I mean, we've been kind of trapped in fire season for a week at a time, 5 or 6 days. What is something that you can do to bring in fresh air? Is there anything that you can bring in fresh air and protect the inside house from having it? Is it worth it to open a window and let the smoke air come in and then purify the air? What would you say is kind of a good way if it's a long-term fire exposure, smoke exposure?
Yeah, and that is either particularly challenging or expensive one to mitigate a lot of times. There are certain systems like a energy recovery ventilator or heat recovery ventilator you see oftentimes in less temperate environments, so like the where it gets very cold in the winter, and using the indoor heat to warm the outdoor air, and so you're getting some ventilation, by bringing in that outdoor air, but not losing the energy and the comfort on the inside. So those systems, again, if you're renting, you might not be able to install that. You might be able to talk to your landlord about getting that done. It can increase the value of the home. But if you can't go that route, then trying to bring in, again, like through a window or something, at least temporarily, sure, just watch as the indoor anything indoor is kind of like peaking, and then CO2 in particular, right? Above 1,000, 1,500, like you start to be a little more lethargic. So that's going to be like your biggest worry of like kind of battening down the hatches too much. So temporarily opening and filtering as quickly as you possibly can, maybe putting on a mask for that little bit. I think there are some air filters that you can get that direct air intake through a window. Love to see more options out there than just the like recirculating air indoors.
And then my last question for you is, we've all seen these, airnow.gov, these resources to see what the air quality is outside. You mentioned it, your air quality index. If I'm at my house and I see that it's 200 on this air quality index, or it's red or purple or yellow, what should I expect inside my house? The difference between outside and inside?
Yeah, we had during the 2018. I think we have a couple of blog posts between 2018 and 2020, where we were comparing in the Bay Area the indoor and outdoor, and again, it's like an average across every home in Bay Area, and it's not equal. These levels are different in every individual city and zone, but I mean, the outdoor and indoor, even in the average sense, was pretty comparable. So, a lot of people, there might have been quite a few people that were, filtering really well and things like that, but there were a lot of people who couldn't do enough. And we actually have, sometimes I'll kind of like browse around. We have a map in our Aware Home app that takes a lot of outdoor sources and compares it to indoor. So we're kind of like averaging in neighborhoods and things like that, of actual like neighbors and stuff. And you can see, like sometimes I've I've seen that the AQI in like hundreds, 200s for the average indoor in a region, which is ridiculous. I feel for those folks. They might not be able to, or they might not know.
Yeah, we've had a number of customers who were out, in Philadelphia, went for a jog, and they're like, "What is the smell?" Right? They had never kind of experienced this, and so, like Tim was saying, it's spreading everywhere. Right? The smoke is going to cover everywhere, and it's not just for us lucky West Coasters. So, well, thank you very much, Dean. Appreciate your time, and it was great having you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean, Tim, and Maureen. We're really lucky again to have experts that really cover the full experience. And I think one of the really refreshing things is just how much you guys were yes-anding and reinforcing each other's recommendations. So, what we see is when we talk to the actual experts, there's a real consensus on what is happening, what needs to be done, and everything else. And when we spend our time on Twitter, we see a very different picture. So one of the things that both Tim and Maureen highlighted is the idea of controlled or prescribed burns. And, those have been practiced by indigenous cultures around the world. And it seems like there's a real will for that, both from the scientific evidence and also from the frontline firefighters. So talk to us about those, and talk to us about why it's been so hard to get the political support for that, and what we as voters and citizens can do to support more controlled and prescribed burns.
Well, maybe I'll go first, Maureen. I'm with you from Eugene, Oregon, which is part of where the ancestral homelands of the Kalapuya Indigenous people lived, and they lived in the Willamette Valley for over 10,000 years. Very, living through prolonged periods of drought or high temperatures, east wind events, fires of all kinds. And how did they do it without owning a single air tanker or fire engine or bulldozer? They did it not by fighting against fire, but actively working with it. And anthropologists consider the Kalapuya to have a pyroculture because they use it so frequently and intentionally and very carefully to manage various foods and fibers, protect their village sites, keep their travel corridors open. And that's, through the great span of our species' existence, we've had this unique relationship with fire. We're the only animal that knows how to start fires and are crazy enough to try to stop all fires. So it's just been in the last 100 years or so that we've had this anomaly where we've been socially conditioned to fear and fight all forest fires. And that's just kind of, I believe that's just not part of our species' nature that really comes out when you go camping. And the first thing you want to do is light a campfire and gather around the fire. So let's flip that paradigm and re-embrace our species' role with fire. Relearn, I should say, from just about every indigenous people on Earth, and work with fire instead of fight against all fires. That's our philosophy.
Sorry, yeah, I absolutely agree with what Tim said. And it's really about building a culture. And if you want to look for where that's actually been successful, in the Southeast in Florida, they have a culture of prescribed fire that they have maintained for decades, if not the last century, where it's just accepted. Oh, it's time. Clearly, it's prescribed fire season. There's going to be a little bit of smoke, and it's just an accepted part of the sort of pulse of the progression of the year, that we're just going to start some of these fires. And again, so we need to be culturally accepting of the role that wildfire plays, sort of broadly. And I think some of the other barriers are, when you set a fire, you're purposely putting smoke into the air. And under controlled fire conditions, we can try to minimize that smoke impact by looking again at the wind and the weather patterns. And so there's sort of not good smoke, but more controlled smoke, minimal smoke exposure, but someone put that smoke in the air on purpose. So now you have someone to blame for putting the smoke in the air, versus, oh no, this is an act of God, these really hazardous smoke conditions that you can't necessarily, the government didn't set this on fire on purpose, right? And so I think again, it's just getting back to the culture of accepting that smoke's inevitable. Under what conditions are we going to experience it?
Well, and part of that culture is also recognizing the wisdom of indigenous cultures that have practiced this for so very long. Before this, I spoke to Margot Robbins, who's a Yurok elder and the head of Cultural Fire. And, to what you're saying, Tim, about how dependent they were on fire, she made the point that in order to have the right kind of supple twigs to be able to make the traditional baskets, they needed that fire because that's what created that new growth. So I think in general, we just have a lot to learn from indigenous and traditional cultures about how to live with this land, which they've obviously spent 10,000 years here, and how to manage and embrace fire.
And I will say there's a little, sorry to interrupt, but there's a little bit of hope there. I'm seeing a lot of momentum behind exactly that, and not just like learning from, but partnering with, right? It's
Yeah.
not something like we're going to take your knowledge and then we're going to use it. It's a matter of we're going to partner with you in a way that we can all sort of work together to take advantage of the wisdom. Yeah.
Well, and that was part of what Margot spoke to. She said there's been, especially from firefighters like Tim, there's been a real embrace of a partnership between, the essentially the federal and the local firefighting services and Indigenous communities. And so I think that's real grounds for hope. And obviously, as you say, Maureen, the example of South Florida, it shows that it can be done. And so one of the biggest things it sounds like we all need to do is change our attitude on prescribed fires and controlled burns, and not just have this idea that all fire is bad, right? It's about fire in the right context at the right times to set ourselves up for success when summer rolls around.
Yep.
Exactly. We call it the maldistribution of fire. We're getting too much of the wrong kinds of fire at the wrong times, places, and conditions. Not enough of the right kinds of fire at the right times, places, and conditions. We need to alter that distribution there.
100%. 100%. And so we actually had a comment from Marissa DeFrati, and she was saying, that if you keep resisting politics, politics will keep blocking progress. And so part of it is that we need to, on the one hand, resist sort of the simplistic narratives, and really just, reinforce again and again that all of these perspectives have real value, and that, it's not an either or, and that we need all of these tools in order to have a cohesive playbook. Yep. Stephen, any questions that you wanted to call out?
Yeah, Robert from Sacramento asked, Lake Tahoe is famous for its blue crystal clear waters. Now there's concerns that the recent wildfires will affect that. What does wildfire smoke do to our waters?
Well, what does cloud cover do to the reflection of water? I mean, the ash falling out of the sky will probably make it more turbid for a while. But there are always short-term and long-term effects of wildfire. And we tend to really focus on the short-term impacts without those, keeping in mind the long-term effects. Imagine if the first pilgrims from Europe had inhabited an evergreen forest, and their first autumn in the New World, when the leaves dropped, they said, "Oh my God, the forest is dying. Let's chop it down and plant a new one." I mean, that's the analogy I'm drawing with these kind of short-term effects of fire, and it does alter the landscape. Next spring, a lot of these ground may be bare ash and mud. Soon enough, we're going to see a proliferation of wildflowers following the wildfires, and all kinds of new plants and animals. Just the seeds been waiting for their time in the sun, and all the critters you'll be seeing flocking to some of these areas. Some species actually depend on burned areas for their habitat, for food or shelter or whatever. And so, just gotta, the blue waters of Lake Tahoe may turn a little gray for a while. They'll be blue again, and the forest will grow again. Again, fire's been on the planet for 420 million years. How did we survive? The forest was not all destroyed. It was, in many ways, forests are born in fire. They're more like nurseries than mortuaries, in my opinion.
Well, I, for one, cannot wait for morel mushroom season. They only pop up after fires.
So it is definitely about changing our attitudes. And so we had a question from Kyle from Seattle. Obviously employees are moving around all the time. People are moving to different parts of the country. And so part of that is that, we're often strangers in these new environments, and, we don't necessarily know how to interact or even think about conceptualize fire smoke. As Stephen was saying, some of our customers live in Philadelphia or Boston. They've never encountered this stuff. So what are some of the most important things that a company can do to help support their employees in dealing with these new threats and these new challenges? And I'd love to hear from each of you on this.
I guess I can start. I mean, I think we've certainly worked with a number of companies that often extend, especially in this remote work environment that we've had for the past year and a half or more. The kind of like at home work perks and things like that, and so one of those things they can do just to improve productivity, but also overall health and wellness. Like companies have a lot invested in us as employees, and so ensuring that they have the best work environment, lifestyle, overall health and everything. So whether it's buying those standalone filters or air quality monitors, all those sort of things can help. I mean, wildfire preparedness kits of masks and whatever else, and then I know that there's inevitably going to be a push for back at work, and how can you reassure folks, even in a non-pandemic world, that it might actually be safer in the office, or there are safe spaces there, where maybe even the rest of the family can come into the office, because it may mean breathing healthier air, because the building can do that better than somebody's individual home, perhaps. So yeah, I think there's a lot that companies can do.
Yeah, and Timothy, I mean, you must see lots of people who are out-of-staters. They suddenly find themselves in a wildland urban environment, and they have no idea how to handle that. So, what are some of the things that companies can do for employees who are living in those areas to help prep them?
That's a great question. I'd rather take the big picture, and particularly the companies, that are part of the EarthUP community. I think the single greatest threat to the planet is climate change. And though that smoke plume from a wildfire looks very scary, a lot of that's water vapor. That invisible smoke coming out of tailpipes and smokestacks and pipelines that is altering the chemistry of the atmosphere and the oceans. Unless and until we really, cut down, eventually eliminate burning fossil fuels, anything and everything we do to the forest or homes, whatever, just really won't matter. There'll be so many other impacts. Wildfires are just a symptom, not really a main source of climate change. So putting the collective power of all these companies and their employees and the communities they're part of to really force leaders to deal with the climate crisis, that to me is the number one problem, number one avenue to do. You'll find no climate change deniers on the front lines of wildfires right now. None. And they really depend on those of us here to really back them up and force some policy change. So I would say take the big picture and really, work all the companies together to really force some change from our policymakers.
And it also sounds like, Timothy, that, I know that there's been a lot more press on just how little wildland firefighters are often paid. They're out there risking their lives for not a lot of pay, not a lot of money. And it seems like what you're saying is, if we really care about them and we really want to support them, then providing the cultural support for prescribed burns and forest management, but also really taking action on climate change. That's some of the best support we could give. We should also pay them more.
Yeah, agreed.
Awesome. Maureen, so, you really emphasize these two sides of the triangle. What would you say that companies should be doing in terms of supporting their employees who might be new to some aspect of the wildfire and smoke experience?
Yeah, I think some of these, events like this, education and really giving them information for local impacts, right? So again, it's going to vary from place to place on where they go, but giving them, I love the idea of a disaster prepared kit. I love the idea of the checklist that EarthUP has, right, to get ready for fire season. Again, that's going to depend. In Seattle, that would include sort of having your air filters ready, but out there in the WUI, that would include having, like Tim said, your go bag and your evacuation plan. And then, so giving them these resources and education for what it means to live in a particular area, and really sort of tailoring it, not having this generic thing of like smoke's bad, right? But actually, you're moving here. These are the kinds of things that you need to consider in this location. I think those would be really valuable for employees.
Well, and specifically, I mean, you've highlighted the difference between these different types of ecosystems, right? So also part of it is, and that fire behavior has clearly changed already from the 20th century to the 21st century, right? And I know from your recent NPR interview that we maybe even see that fire change even more in the next decade or so.
Yeah.
So it really has to be kept current, right? Like we can't rely on last decade's understanding or last century's understanding.
Yeah, a lot of the research, so that first graph that I put up with fire over time, that sort of, we have good records, say from the 80s, and particularly satellite data from the 80s to today. That's an extremely short window for how some of these ecological systems develop and can change. And any study that we do within that 30, now 40-year window is fairly limited for how it can be extrapolated, say, into the future, or even what it means for what actually had happened in the past. There's this concept we call stationarity in statistics. The idea that the processes that are driving what we see now, are those going to be stationary? Are they going to be the same in the future? Or are they actually going to change? Some of the climate-fire relationships we think might not be stationary in the future. And so we do need to consider how that might change in the longer term.
Well, listen, we didn't ask any one of these experts to plug EarthUP, but they all did a beautiful job of plugging it. So we really appreciate that. And yes, we've worked very hard as a content team to make sure that all of these resources are available. We've pulled from Firewise, we've pulled together the best resources on Go Kits. A lot of the stuff that Dean has recommended in terms of air sealing your home, reducing the chemical load of your indoor air, ventilation, filtration, all of that is on the EarthUP platform and is available to you guys. And obviously, the climate is definitely not a stationary thing anymore. Wildfire behavior is not a stationary thing anymore, and the political climate is also not a stationary thing anymore. So, as things develop and as things change, we will continue to update you and continue to provide you the best resources. And in terms of the best resources, that's why we're so lucky to have Maureen, Tim, and Dean on today. And we owe you guys a tremendous debt, not only for the work that you do 365 days a year, but also for the hour and a half that you have given us today. And across the bottom of this screen, Mara, who also hasn't been visible on this, but has been running the show, is flashing up some of the resources that Maureen, Tim, and Dean have recommended. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you guys have any questions or comments or concerns, we can also make sure to follow up and connect with the experts and pass those on. And also, if you want any future webinars or any other topics, just let us know. Just shoot a comment either in the chat or alternatively, you can message us on Intercom on EarthUP itself. And on the top row on EarthUP itself this week, we'll be featuring all of our wildfire resources. So thank you so much, everybody, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.